they often talk about our illiterate stage and say we were not illiterate. We were unliterate. Some of us spoke 3 and 4 languages.
The second most prominent African in Roman history is probably Septimius Severus, who was the emperor around the year 200 AD. 193, after a series of wars, he became emperor.
In 1988, Atlanta Public Schools began an ambitious project. They started plans to infuse materials about Africans and African Americans into all school curriculum. But before you can infuse information, you have to know it. So Dr. Asa Hilliard became one of the first people contacted about the plan. Hilliard holds the Fuller Callaway Chair at Georgia State University and has spent decades establishing himself and his research as respected in the field. Dr. Hilliard agreed to serve as a consultant for the project and not charge for his services. He also suggested those organizing the infusion program take a trip to Portland, Oregon. That's where this woman, Carolyn Leonard, explained how it took almost 8 years to get a reluctant school board administration to fund and coordinate a multicultural infusion project. In Portland, the schools will spend time developing materials to infuse not only African history and contributions, but also those of Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, and European descent. As she'll explain later, Mrs. Leonard says many people don't want to know about mistakes in history books. They usually fight the idea of an infusion project, and they say it usually doesn't have anything to offer. She also says many of the people with those ideas are educators. She also acknowledges, though, that there's too much unused information to ignore. This document proves that point. It's simply called the Portland Baseline Essays. It discusses very briefly African contributions to core curriculum in math, science, art, music, social studies, and language arts. The authors of each essay are people who have spent their lives researching these topics from an Afrocentric point of view. They're all experts in their fields, and you'll meet them during the course of this 10-part series. Atlanta organizers took the ideas presented in the baseline lectures and decided to mold them into a form not usually appreciated in public schools: television. That's how the idea of a video series got started. But with the idea of an innovative approach came additional problems. Televised presentations require pictures. Atlanta again had unique resources, most specifically this man. Dr. Hilliard says Larry Williams possibly has one of the largest historical Afrocentric slide collections in the world. Most of the video for this series came from that collection. It's supported with shots of slides videotaped by Atlanta Public Schools from the collections of Dr. Rosalind Jeffries of New York, Dr. Ivan Van Sertima of California, and several others. All of these visuals help to add support to the research and specific lecture workshops. By May of 1989, 4 half-hour segments of the series had aired, all produced, written, and researched on a very limited budget. That summer, the entire infusion project received official funding from Atlanta Public Schools. In the fall, production began again, not only on the video series, but also on a series of lecture tapes, creating packaged speeches from each expert, flown in to train the teachers. With the resources available, the emphasis of the video series started to change. Instead of the baseline essays, each segment molded itself to expand on one of Dr. Hilliard's 10 points in African history. This change began with segment 5 of African American Culture: A Second Look. To let you know what to expect in the next 2 months, we'll go through each point briefly. Point number 1, Africa is the cradle of early man and all 6 hominids. Point number 2, Africa is the cradle of modern man, Homo sapiens sapiens. Point number 3, Africa is the cradle of civilization. Point number 4, Africa once held a position as world teacher, including teacher to the Western world. Point 5, there was and still is a continent-wide cultural unity among Africans. Point 6, the first African movement throughout the world came from thousands of years of migrations. Part 7 describes the 2,000-year assault on African history and heritage. Part 8 describes the African diaspora as it exists today. Point 9, African people have resisted domination we'll give you surprising facts. And in 10, we'll describe how even under slavery, colonization, segregation, and apartheid, African people have made monumental cultural contributions. Of course, some would question the necessity of explaining African contributions at all, specifically in school. But before we hear from the experts, let the students answer for themselves.
The African culture has been looked down upon, basically, and that, like I said, it just motivated me.
It boosts my confidence because it makes me feel as if that we were not uncivilized and that we can compete with any other heritage that there is.
When you ask how many people descend from Europeans, the kids all raise their hand. I'm from Denmark, I'm from here, I'm from there. When you say how many descend from Africa and you have 20 kids who are of African descent, and they all look at one another like, I'm not from Africa. Well, where are they from? The major barrier is getting people to recognize that, first of all, what we have to say is true. Even getting some of our own people to recognize that what is being said is true. Because after all, a lot of us have been socialized to aspire to be white. And so suddenly to turn around and say, after you've worked so long to be non-black or non-African, to suddenly say it's okay to be African. And so that's one of the biggest barriers. What I want to be able to do is to look into the eyes of African-American students and be able to say to them, how many of you come from Africa, and have students raise their hands.
Many of those we classify as wise have said that a people without a history have no foundation and will find it hard to progress. If you believe that all any one African has as a heritage is slavery, singing, and civil rights, you've got a lot to learn. And I hope this series will do a lot to teach you. Let's begin that learning process with debunking a basic premise. Actually, we'll tackle two of them. False premise number 1, slavery was the first exposure Africans had to civilization. And false premise number 2, ancient Egypt was populated by people who looked like or were European Caucasians. To elaborate on both concepts, we'll continue the rest of the half hour with a question and answer session with Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Hilliard, as you and I sit here and talk, our viewers are seeing a 1968 Life magazine that focused on Egypt.
Right.
All the statues look Caucasian.
Right.
Why would you say, looking at this type of documentation, that the ancient Egyptians were black?
Remember that that magazine was produced by people who were European, and they had a vested interest in a certain image of Europe, especially considering that that vested interest in a positive image of Europe related to a negative image of Africa and African people has grown out of these hundreds of years of slavery and colonization, which needed to be justified, and also the years of segregation in the United States, and even now neo-segregation. So that in a racist society, it is hard to get clear and accurate images. And so the kinds of images that we can share, which are the accurate and true images of the people of ancient Egypt, are generally those that have been overlooked completely.
Such as, give me names and examples. You gave me a shot of the Sphinx from a side view.
That's right.
That is amazing.
That's right. Well, of course, the Sphinx is an African stone monument, like Stone Mountain in Georgia, like Mount Rushmore, except older and bigger, and of course first. And it has a Greek name. Its African name is Horimakhet. Now, normally when that is shown, if it is shown at all, it is shown from the front, because the front is ambiguous as to race, but its profile is clearly a black person. And so that has almost never been shown. When you look at the pattern, rarely will you ever see the profile of the Sphinx.
How did the ancient Egyptians describe themselves? I mean, surely they've left lots of records. Did they call themselves